Welcome to Human Monsters. Aside from his birthday being September 4th, 1954, in Deal, Kent, England, very little biographical information about David Fuller has been made publicly available. As you will soon find out, this is a very sick individual whose misogynistic feelings were pathological and beyond his capacity for self-control. He was married 3 times. His hobbies were bird watching, cycling, live music, and photography. He was the unofficial photographer for the English rock band Cutting Crew, and even went on tour with them in 1985. Their lyric, "I just died in your arms tonight," is morbidly relevant to this story. I'm going to assume that you've never copulated with a corpse. I'm going to hold you to that. David Fuller, people close to the man likely did not assume the same of him. Well, they had no idea how ass over tea kettle wrong they were. He liked them cold and hard and taut. His least favorite word in the English language was no, and he seldom heard that word from his sex partners, victims. When you become known as the morgue monster, there's likely some connection to post-mortem perversity. Some men like to watch women remove their clothes. David Fuller enjoyed pulling them out of metal drawers. I would say, to each their own, but I don't want one of you saying I encouraged you. David Fuller harmed the living too, having raped and murdered 2 women. Ultimately, he preferred the dead to the living, and the dead would be spared the emotional torment that came with being murdered. This went on for 3 decades, and considering that Scotland Yard failed to catch him during that time, well, it did not go over well with the British public. If you've ever seen a hospital maintenance worker in action, you likely imagined nothing more disturbing than his mandate to mop up the product of some patient's incontinence. In the case of hospital maintenance worker David Fuller, the mess that needed to be mopped up was his twisted sexual sensibility. Also, he was an electrician, not a janitor. Us guys want our women's nipples to be hard, but we accept that, among living women, there is a time limit to that. David Fuller was looking for an extension, at least until the decomposition process was underway. Did he use KY? He would have had to. Then again, maybe necrophiles aren't picky about bodily secretions and their orifices of origin. Maybe they like it cold, dry, and hard, as previously mentioned. 15 years of David Fuller's life were a P. Diddy freak party between one living man and his dead victims. No baby oil. Now I will walk you through the murders. The first woman to meet her untimely demise at the hands of David Fuller was 25-year-old Wendy Nell. Fuller was an amateur photographer, and he took his film to the Super Snaps store where Wendy worked to have it developed. Wendy was the manager of the store, which was located in Tunbridge Wells, Kent. Pretty impressive for a 25-year-old. Being an electrician, murderer, and necrophile, less impressive. Wendy had a boyfriend, and in June 1987, he was shocked and heartbroken to find her naked and dead on a blood-soaked bed in her bedsit. She had been raped and strangled. November 1987. David Fuller seemed to have it in for young women who lived in bedsits, for he kidnapped 20-year-old Caroline Pierce from her bedsit. She had been a waitress at a restaurant called Buster Brown's, at which Fuller had been a regular patron. When she was found dead, she was naked, save for a pair of tights. A farmhand found her in a flooded drain in the town of Romney, with which Fuller was familiar because he frequently took cycling trips to that area. Detectives investigated this crime for several weeks, but forensic samples were unhelpful, and since none of David Fuller's DNA was in a database, the identity of the murderer would remain a mystery for years. Due to this impasse, the budget, resources, and efforts contributed in the investigation were reduced in scale. These killings, which became known as the bedsit murders, would go unsolved for over 30 years. Now on to his dead victims. It is estimated that David Fuller raped the corpses of at least 101 women and girls. During his time as an electrician at the Kent and Sussex Hospital, which has since closed, and the Tunbridge Wells Hospital in Pembury, Fuller defiled the dead as he kept the power running, alternating current, direct current. Between 2005 and 2020, he raped the cadavers of females aged 9 to 100. As the electrician in residence, he had been issued a swipe card, which gave him access to most units in the hospitals. The morgues were no exception. One common denominator among the corpses was that some died in accidents while others perished during surgeries. So, not only was he turned on by the turned off, but he liked gore. He preferred blood to KY and baby oil. Though there were surveillance cameras installed in many areas of the hospitals, the morgues were not visually monitored. In what was the worst case of documented irony in medical history imaginable, banning the cameras from the morgue was done to preserve the dignity of the dead. Meanwhile, David Fuller stripped the corpses of their dignity. He probably didn't look very dignified either as he went about that business. Given his sick predilection to become aroused in the presence of the dead, he couldn't have been happier than in the postmortem room. The doors to the refrigerator where the bodies were stored were unlocked. There is no word on whether a box of cow brand baking soda was kept in those refrigerators. Sorry, I couldn't resist. Though there were no video cameras in the hospital's morgues to document Fuller's abuse of the cadavers, it was documented nonetheless. In the hard drive of his computer at home in Heathfield, East Sussex, police found 818,051 images and 504 videos of him raping and molesting dead female bodies. Before those materials confirmed that David Fuller was a murderer and sex offender, detectives still had their work cut out for them. DNA did prove that he was the bedsit murderer. But how? In 2019, an enhanced DNA sample gleaned from the tights Caroline Pierce was wearing when she was found led to a new phase in the investigation. However, the real breakthrough emerged from the remains of Wendy Nell. A national database of DNA profiles provided matches with 90 individuals. After whittling them down, police found a match in a relative of David Fuller, which led the trail to David Fuller himself. When police paid a visit to Fuller's home, he denied having known the two murder victims, but he was arrested nonetheless in December 2020. A closer examination of his DNA confirmed that he was the bedsit murderer. His fingerprint was a match for a bloody print found on a plastic bag in Wendy Nell's bedsit. Police searched his home and found the hidden library of images and videos that showcased the man's depravity. All told, within computer hard drives, CDs, and floppy disks, there were over 14 million documented sex crimes. After having once denied committing the murders, he confessed on the 6th day of his trial in 2021. He further fessed up to having committed 44 crimes consisting of the sexual abuse of 78 corpses between 2008 and 2020. It was the Kent and Essex Serious Crime Directorate that was able to identify that David Fuller had raped 101 corpses. Fuller was sentenced to life in prison. He will never be eligible for parole. The following is a victim impact statement made by the mother of the 9-year-old girl he defiled following her death. The victim's name has not been revealed publicly, so I will refer to her as Jane Doe. The mother's statement. David, I can't believe I have put these words to paper, but I have to because of what you did in the mortuary. I have not much to say that I can tell you. What I can say is my beautiful daughter was the kindest person I ever met, and never met anyone else. In her short 9 years, she laughed and was happy and grateful in life. Nothing you have done can never change that. My daughter died from a complication of the common cold. My life has been an existence, and my sole purpose is to look after my son. I need you to understand the pain this has caused me and my family. Out of the blue, the police knocked on my door to tell me what had happened to her. She was my baby, and couldn't say no to a dirty old man who abused her body, but she would have. I was always vigilant about telling her about sexual abuse, and she knew that there was disgusting people in the world, and rape. It was rape, and so disgusting, it would never appear in anyone's imagination. Every day I would go to that mortuary, and real human beings and staff members helped me dress her, and I would kiss her for weeks. But now that special time is ruined because that disgusting man there did what he did. He would move her toys and blankets and have sex with my baby. I can't even touch them now because of what he did. It breaks my heart. I can't eat. I can't sleep. I feel sick. I think of her birthmark she hated, but I loved. Her long blonde hair I brushed. But now I see that awful man touching her in that way. I don't know how I will carry on with my life now. Most of all, my pain and guilt because I left her there in that hospital that was supposed to be a safe place. And I can't comfort and tell her, I'm sorry, baby. I know what he's done. How will I make it up to her? How will I stand by her now? And how can I look after her body, disrespected by him? That man has taken everything from me. A relative of another victim said this of David Fuller: I feel such agonizing pain at the thought of what happened. I desperately didn't want her to go to the mortuary as it was cold and clinical, but I was told she would be safe. Now I have to live with the knowledge that she was violated by this manipulative, despicable man. I am angry, resentful, unable to relax. You have proved that monsters exist. You are cocky, arrogant, and despicable. You are the worst of humanity. The following sentencing remarks were made by Justice Chima Grubb on December 7th, 2022. In June and November 1987, you murdered two vibrant young women, Wendy Nell and Caroline Pierce, in Tunbridge Wells, Kent. Those were sexually motivated killings. Despite an extensive and well-publicized investigation, you were not identified. Indeed, you escaped detection until 2019, when a scientific case review re-examined the DNA findings from the murder scenes. Following a vast deployment of police staff nationwide to visit nearly 100 people and take samples to compare with those found 32 years earlier, the police arrived at your front door. A sample taken from you produced a DNA profile which matched that from the murders exactly. You were arrested on the 3rd of December 2020. On the 4th of November 2021, you pleaded guilty to the murders 4 days into your trial. During the intervening 40-plus years, you had obtained work in maintenance, firstly at the Kent and Sussex Hospital, where you were employed from January 1989 until July 2011. You then obtained the position of a maintenance supervisor at Pembury Hospital, and you worked there until your arrest. I have no doubt you were wary of the risk of attempting to commit sexual offenses which might be detected given the atmosphere of public alertness in the Tunbridge Wells area after what had become known as the bedsit murders. These employments gave you access to areas which are ordinarily out of bounds to the public, in particular the mortuaries of both hospitals. You would pass through security by using your employee's swipe card when the mortuary staff had gone home from work. Once inside the mortuary, hidden from CCTV surveillance, you were free to systematically and relentlessly sexually abuse the bodies of at least 101 dead women and girls. The youngest was aged 9. The oldest had reached 100 years before her death. Some were abused very shortly after they died, many shortly before or after loved ones had been to see them. You photographed and filmed the acts you carried out using your own digital camera before transferring the images onto computer hard drives which you concealed at home. Evidence of your offending has been discovered dating back to 2005, and as recently as within a week of your arrest. You were never disturbed or challenged in all those years, but you were prepared in case that happened, carrying items of maintenance equipment for subterfuge to ensure you had a ready explanation for your presence in those parts of the hospital out of hours. When your house was searched meticulously after your arrest in December 2020, 4 portable hard drives were found in a box attached to the rear of a chest of drawers in a wardrobe. Elsewhere, explicit printed images of dead women being sexually abused by you were found hidden within the office and the wardrobe. It is clear from the evidence that over the course of many years, you were not only obsessively preserving the images of your abuse, you exhaustively cataloged and indexed them. To do so, you copied images of the mortuary logbook showing the names and ages of those brought into the mortuary. These logbook photographs were taken in 2018 rather than at the time of earlier abuse, and you used the information found there in your complex filing system. Although you denied it, there is evidence that you did research into your victims and potential victims, including looking at social media accounts they had. Once you had captured your sexual abuse, you viewed the images, tried to manipulate the videos, and, on occasion, made large numbers of stills from the videos. One hard drive alone contained over 800,000 images and 504 videos. It took 9 officers 5 months to work through the property seized from your home. The digital material included that found on 1,300 CDs, 2,200 floppy disks, 30 mobile phones, 34,000 photo prints, negatives, slides, and camera film rolls. The contents of the hard drives equated to 23 terabytes of digital material. It took 6 officers working on 4 specially purchased high-powered machines 12 months to process 95% of the material. Your internet search history told the story of a man obsessed with rape and murder, and you viewed images of sexually violent offending against women and girls. One web link marked as an Internet Explorer favorite of yours had a URL including the words torture, murder, snuff, video. The task accomplished by the police officers and civilian employees who searched and assessed this material is colossal. Indeed, the extensive teamwork of forces around the country, as well as Kent Constabulary throughout this investigation, should be acknowledged and praised. On the 8th of October 2021, you pleaded guilty to 51 offenses relating to 78 victims who had been identified by that time. These consisted of 33 charges of sexual penetration of a corpse, a charge of voyeurism, and a variety of offenses concerning the taking, making, or possession of indecent images of children and extreme pornographic images. On the 15th of December, almost exactly a year ago, you were sentenced to a whole life order in respect of the murders which the court determined were premeditated and involved sexual conduct shortly before or after the killing. Because of the extent of evidence of sexual conduct before the court, I also concluded that the primary spur for your offending was a deep-seated necromania exhibited in necrophilia. For the 51 sexual offenses against the dead, You were sentenced to a total of 12 years, concurrent to the whole life term. Those concurrent sentences will not add to your whole life order. How could they? But they recognize each individual person against whom you have been discovered to have offended. Since then, a further 13 of your victims have been identified. 10 more remain unidentified and will remain so. On the 4th of October this year, you were charged with 16 offenses. These are 12 counts of sexual penetration of a corpse contrary to Section 71 of the Sexual Offenses Act 2003, and 4 offenses of possession of an extreme pornographic image contrary to Section 63(1) of the Criminal Justice and Immigration Act 2008. You entered guilty pleas to all of those counts on the 3rd of November 2022, and I must now sentence you. These charges relate to women aged between 45 and 92 at the time of their deaths. Some of the charges concern women who cannot be identified. A number are group offenses in which up to 7 victims are included in a single count. You violated the bodies of all these women while many were still wearing medical equipment from the treatment they had received from doctors trying to save their lives, such as defibrillation pads, catheters, and cannulas. I will describe the detail of your offending in brief and composite terms. You filmed and photographed your penis in the mouths, anuses, and vaginas of the dead. You penetrated the bodies with your fingers and tongue. You sucked the breasts of some victims and masturbated while assaulting them. You carried out repeated offenses against victims on the same occasion and on multiple 3 successive days. Some you manhandled across a doorway about 12 inches from the floor. Others you placed on the floor, on a chair, and in different positions. Some victims you sat astride. One woman's body received an injury to her nose as you assaulted her. The last count I have to deal with you for concerns extreme pornographic images which were grossly offensive, disgusting, or otherwise of an obscene character, and portrayed in an explicit and realistic way acts which involved sexual interference with 7 female human corpses. One of those 7 women was the subject of this offending on the 30th of November 2020, days before your arrest for the 2 murders from 1987. The systematic nature of the way you had recorded your offending can be illustrated by reference to one portable hard drive. Exhibit KH83 contained 3 folders: Necro Lord, Register, and Deadly. Some of the content could not be accessed. Within the folder Deadly was a subfolder titled Deadliest. That also contained subfolders. One of the subfolders titled 00 Best Yet contained a further 36 folders. Of these, 27 were titled using a number, then a woman's name, and then a further number. Within these folders, you stored images of you sexually interfering with the corpses of women and girls. It is by looking at such images, comparing the creation dates and other records with the mortuary logbook and other evidence, that the identities of the 91 named victims were found. It would be wrong to name any victim, and it is unnecessary to do so. Among those you abused were women who had led fulfilling and rich lives. They were the best. One had flown across the Atlantic in a propeller-driven airplane via Iceland alone. Another was a talented skier. One had worked at Bletchley Park during World War II. Many had long and happy marriages. A number had worked hard in professions such as teaching or in the NHS, caring for others and looking after the interest of their students, clients, and patients. All had families that they nurtured and loved. Some spent the last part of their lives in suffering, whether through disease or old age. But they didn't lose their dignity until you decided to take it from them. Your victims are not all among the dead. They fill this courtroom and other places which are connected to this court by video link. The court has heard of the impact on these families. When members of Kent Police's Family for Engagement team visited to break the news, it was incomprehensible to them. How could their loved ones be so violated in a place which was meant to care for them and keep them in peace? Some have the comfort of faith, others not even that. They describe being heartbroken by the immorality of your abhorrent acts. You have sullied and stolen fond memories. There is the inconsolable guilt of not being able to protect the vulnerable, of their own and their families' damaged mental health, the impossibility of unknowing what they have been told happened, of unseeing the images they have imagined. It has shaken their sense of being able to trust the world and trust hospitals. Some of them have worked in the very hospitals involved. Most have not shared the news with anyone but the closest family. Having to keep the secret is another unsought responsibility. They have been able to unburden themselves to this court. They feel that they are mourning their wives, mothers, grandmothers, aunts, sisters, daughters, and nieces all over again, often many years after their deaths. They have been left in a dark place. They have expressed the outrage and revulsion that the women you abused would have felt at your objectification of them, and they give voice to them. Quite understandably, they express feelings of shame, even though they know they are not the ones at fault. Despite this, they have shone a light into court today by describing in loving words the special people they lost. They believe the pain is ineradicable, that it will never go, and that you have stolen the happy memories they have. The court has listened carefully to and read every single word of these statements. If there is any benefit to the transparency of this sentencing hearing for which you have had to come to court and witness in public, their distress, may it be of some comfort to each person who has spoken or written that they have been able to pay tribute to their precious loved ones and give them the dignity of their own memories in life. If it is at all possible, I hope that the end of this sentencing process will strengthen them and allow them to leave you here while they go on with their lives. That they can banish the shadow you have cast, let it go, and return to the good times and the purer memories of the person they knew and lost. There is a settled process by which the court reaches sentence. I must assess the degree of your responsibility, establish the harm caused, and consider aggravating and mitigating features. There is no sentencing guideline for sexual penetration of a corpse or for possessing extreme pornography. The maximum sentence for both offenses is 2 years imprisonment. In my judgment, each of these offenses was of high culpability, all of them of the highest possible blameworthiness. The offenses committed in the mortuaries involved an astonishing breach of trust and invasion of privacy, which was repeated so much that it became habitual. The dead bodies of women were used for your sexual gratification. Each was recorded, and some were further manipulated when reduced to digital images. The mortuary offenses were also of the highest category of harm, as the impact statements the court has heard have testified. You had no regard for the dignity of the dead. Women who had recently died were attacked at a time when they were utterly alone and unable to resist or report your exploitation. As you well know, those who cared for them were mourning their loss at the very time you were abusing them. There are numerous aggravating features obvious in the description of what you did. The location, the repetition, the abuse of position, the utter degradation of those recently living human beings, and in particular, the multiplicity of victims. There is no mitigation. I have seen no evidence of genuine remorse as opposed to hollow regret now you are under public scrutiny. A number of sentences are to be made concurrent, and I have paid careful attention to ensure the sentence overall complies with the totality guideline provided by the Sentencing Council. The law obliges me to allow a quarter reduction for the guilty pleas. Although the sentence I pass now will be concurrent to the whole life order, obviously it cannot be otherwise. It is right to pass separate sentences for each offense so as to acknowledge the offenses against each individual woman. Had these offenses come before me for sentence individually, each sentence would have been much more severe. Had I been sentencing for these 16 offenses on the 15th of December last year, the total sentence for the sexual offending would have been greater than 12 years imprisonment, concurrent to the whole life order. The sentences today must be proportionate to those passed last year, because the offending had all been discovered by then, but the victims not identified, and the offending is all part of the same course of conduct over the same period of time. And who are you, David Fuller? You are 68 years old. In 1973 and 1976, you were convicted of dozens of burglaries committed by climbing into homes through windows. You spent the subsequent years living a lie, the facade of a mild and ordinary life. While in seclusion, you committed revolting and outrageous acts of the deepest darkness. You have a family who you deceived over all those years. As I told you last year, the depravity of what you did to those you killed and those you defiled after death reveals that your conscience is seared. It is almost impossible to believe that a single man can cause the misery to so many that you have done. But you did it, and in consequence, you are paying the price that human justice can exact, the rest of your mortal life in prison. I order forfeiture and destruction of the physical evidence of your offending, which has been listed on a schedule consisting of 27 exhibits made up of numerous computer drives, disks, and images. On counts 1 to 10, which reflect the sexual penetration of individual women, the sentence is 4 months imprisonment on each consecutive. On count 11, which is a collective count for the filming and photographing of the victims in counts 1-10, the sentence is 4 months concurrent. On count 12, a collective count covering the photographing and videoing of victims against whom no penetration can be proved, the sentence is 3 months concurrent. On counts 13 and 14, which concern sexual penetration of 3 victims who remain unidentified, the sentence is 4 months consecutive on each count. On counts 15 and 16, which both concern photographing and videoing of unidentified victims, the sentence is 4 months concurrent. The total sentence imposed today is one of 4 years imprisonment. It will be served consecutive to the sentence of 12 years imposed for sexual offenses in December 2021 and concurrent to the whole life order. You will remain in prison until your death. He received a similar sentence in 2022 for abusing 23 other cadavers. To prove that I am also supportive of diversity and inclusion, I'm including the profile of a female necrophile to this episode. To do any less would be sexist, right? Karen Margaret Greenlee was born in 1958. She spent her early life in California. According to her father, Al Myers, she was molested when she was 8 years old. The sexual abuse didn't end there. She was raped by one of her teachers when she was 14 years old while living in Sonoma County, California. After her family moved to Colfax, California, she graduated from high school. She would marry but had been separated by the time she was arrested. During that time, she had been working as a receptionist at a motel somewhere in the southwestern United States. Now on to the events that led to her trial. Karen Greenlee was hired to work as an apprentice embalmer at Memorial Lawn Mortuary in Sacramento, California. Something about this line of work really got to her, for on December 17th, 1979, she snapped and stole the hearse she was driving to a private burial with a deceased 33-year-old male as cargo. When Karen arrived at her destination and took one look at the dead man's family, she drove a donut and sped away. Days later, Greenlee was located near Allegheny in Sierra County. According to Dr. Robert Rockelau, who pumped Greenlee's stomach, she was severely depressed and attempted suicide by ingesting about 20 Tylenols and washed them down with codeine. She survived. When she was found, there was a suicide note 4.5 pages long. In the letter, she confessed to having had sexual relations with between 20 and 40 dead bodies of young men. She characterized it as an addiction. At the time, necrophilia was not illegal in California. You could fuck someone who was already dead. You just couldn't commit the murder that made them a corpse. Due to this legal situation, Greenlee was only punished for stealing the hearse and for interfering with a funeral. She pled guilty and was sentenced to a $255 fine and 11 days in jail. Following her release, she was to undergo therapy as mandated by the court. The therapy was effective, as she said it helped her to make peace with herself. This didn't mark the end of the legal consequences, however. Greenlee and Memorial Lawn Mortuary were sued for $1 million by Marianne Gonzalez, mother of John L. Mercure, who was one of Greenlee's victims. Her reason for the lawsuit was that Karen Greenlee caused her severe emotional distress. The case was brought before the Superior Court. At one hearing, defense psychiatrist Captain Thompson expressed his belief that the incident did not have, quote, much of a lasting impact, end quote, on the victim's mother. He pointed out that she had a history of alcoholism and depression. Richard A. Kopuscinski was an embalmer and one of Greenlee's colleagues. He was firm in his belief that the allegations made against Greenlee were groundless, as she was quiet and competent in his view. The lawsuit was settled for $117,000 for general and punitive damages. The following is an interview by Jim Morton that was conducted with Karen Greenlee. It was republished in 2020. It was originally published in 1987 as a collection of essays called Apocalypse Culture. Jim Morton. Back during the trial, from what I read in the newspapers, it seemed like you got very little support. No, none whatsoever. The newspapers were the worst. To this day, I hate reporters. One of them even compared me to Richard Trenton Chase, the vampire killer. What support there was like family obligations. One of my brothers refused to have anything to do with me. He said, I just want to remember her as she was. He came up to me later and apologized, but he still isn't comfortable around me. My other brother was more supportive, but even he had to ask, how'd you do it? Before the trial, I had a boyfriend who found out about it. He got mad and slapped me around. He said I wasn't even a woman, and I could go fuck my dead bodies. I was surprised. He knew. Apparently, a lot of people knew, and I don't know how they knew. With guys, they always felt I went for the bodies because I was hard up, and if I went to bed with them, then that would change me, and they would be the one who would give me such satisfaction I wouldn't need those old corpses anymore. I've run into that a lot. Sometimes I had guys come on to me just for that reason. The question I am most often asked is, how does she do it? Yes, that's the question. People ask questions like that. Even people who seem pretty cool seem to have open minds. Then when you tell them, they say, that's very interesting, then don't want to have much to do with me. I don't mind telling people how I do it. It doesn't matter to me, but anyone adept sexually shouldn't have to ask. People have this misconception that there has to be penetration for sexual gratification, which is bull. The most sensitive part of a woman is the front area, anyway, and that is what needs to be stimulated. Besides, there are different aspects of sexual expression, touchy-feely, 69, even holding hands. That body is just lying there, but it has what it takes to make me happy. The cold, the aura of death, the smell of death, the funereal surroundings, it all contributes. The smell of death? Sure, I find the odor of death very erotic. There are death odors and there are death odors. Now you get your body that's been coating in the bay for 2 weeks, or a burn victim. That doesn't attract me much. But a freshly embalmed corpse is something else. There is also this attraction to blood. When you're on top of a body, it tends to purge blood out of its mouth while you're making passionate love. You'd have to be there, I guess. Of course, with all the AIDS going around, that's the reason I haven't tried anything lately. I'm sure I'd have found a way to get into one of those funeral homes by now, but the group I find attractive, young men in their 20s, are the ones who are dying of AIDS. Did you usually attend the funerals of your corpse/lovers? Yeah, it was convenient working in the funeral homes. I'd get to drive out to the cemetery with the family. I'd get to mourn right along with the family at the loss of that loved one. Except I was groaning in a little different tone. People can't really tell if you're grief-stricken or passion-stricken. I've had members of the families put their arms around me and say, "We're so glad you could come." Then you have to spin this big old yarn. "Yeah, I knew him in school." If the guy didn't have a girlfriend in life, they think you were, "Oh, she's the one." You weren't in Sacramento at the time of the trial, were you? No. I was working in a funeral home in another city and going to school at the same time. It's weird, but the day I got a telegram about the trial telling me to get in touch with my attorney, I went into the funeral home. Somebody, I guess, got wise of me. I know I wasn't seen, but I think somebody just figured it out. Of course, they didn't know about Sacramento yet. They found out later, the same day, within 5 hours of each other. Two totally different things caught up with me. I worked in that funeral home for almost a year. That's where I did a lot of my extracurricular activities. I had keys, so I'd slip back in after hours and spend all night there. A guy lived at the funeral home in an apartment downstairs. He drank, so he usually passed out. He had a .357 Magnum under his pillow. The guy that court case was about? John Mercure? Yeah, I understand he was moved out of the cemetery after the trial. That happened at the time I was breaking into the funeral home. There was a side room, one of those arrangement areas, where they always have their case folders out. I read there was an exhumation order for John Mercure. Then I read something in the paper about it. His mother wanted the body exhumed, said she wouldn't bury her cat there. On the day he was supposed to be exhumed, I snuck out into a field across from where he was buried. I sat out in the field and watched them dig up the body and give him to this other mortician. They shipped him back to Michigan. When did you most become aware of your necrophilia? It's something I've been attracted to all my life. I used to hold funeral services for my pets when they died. Had a little pet graveyard. I lived in a small town, and the remains barbecue was next door to the funeral home. To go to the bathroom, you had to use the facilities in the funeral home. I'd find any excuse I could to go to the bathroom. Then I'd take side trips and wander around the mortuary. It didn't scare you like the other kids? No, I loved it. I was real curious. I'd wander around the halls. Do you miss working in funeral homes? Yes, terribly. Even if I wasn't a necrophile, I like mortuary work. I enjoy embalming and everything. You said something previously about the vampire killer, Richard Trenton Chase. He was from Sacramento, wasn't he? Yeah, the second funeral home I worked for, I wasn't working there at the time, got the bodies of Chase's victims, a man and a woman and their child. So I hear the gory details of what the bodies looked like. They were really butchered. They were disemboweled with shit stuffed in their mouths. Chase started by killing animals and drinking their blood, and when he wasn't satisfied with that, he graduated to people. He killed this couple, then kidnapped their child, killed it, and later threw it in a trash can. The mortician who embalmed the bodies said he hardly ever got queasy about anything, but he got sick when he saw those bodies. What's the weirdest case you ever encountered? There was one kid who fell out of a car while his mother was making a turn, and she managed to run over his head. Another kid choked to death on a cigarette wrapper. One guy committed suicide by shooting himself in the head with a pellet rifle. He had to shoot himself several times, and it took him a while to die, but he finally succeeded. There was another guy I worked on. He was a transvestite who somehow strangled himself with his nylons. I don't think it was intentional. I think he was trying to achieve heightened orgasm through strangulation, and he ended up hanging himself. He wouldn't be the first to make that mistake. How about the most unusual funeral? One time, this bunch of religious fanatics held a funeral for one of their members. They didn't want her embalmed, they just wanted her dressed and in the casket. We usually didn't do that, but we decided to be nice and put her up in the stateroom. We were standing outside of that stateroom, and we heard someone saying, "Rise in the name of Jesus." They were praying and slapping the body. They were talking in tongues. That was weird. There seems to be a strong camaraderie between morticians, almost like a secret society. Very much so. Morticians are very tight with each other because most people won't have anything to do with them. I used to, and if I went to a party, I'd always be introduced like, "This is Karen and she's a mortician." But they don't say, "Here's Karen, she's a secretary," or "she's a veterinary assistant." A lot of people are under the misconception that morticians are very straight, very somber. If they ever went back into the prep room and heard all the jokes that are cracked, it would blow that theory right out the window. Did any of those morticians ever testify for or against you at the trial? One funeral director testified on behalf of funeral practices. He was asked how often necrophilia occurs. He said, "It's almost unheard of in this profession." That's a major lie. Yes, definitely. Necrophilia is more prevalent than most people imagine. Funeral homes just don't report it. There was one place that I broke into, and I know that they knew something was wrong. They actually caught me in the act and let me get away. At another place I was working, this guy came up to me and said, "Someone's been messing with the body. It looks like they were trying to fuck the body." I said, "Oh my goodness, really?" I think they figured it out later. I know they know now. One mortician I worked with used a trocar, a large hollow needle used to suction fluids from corpses, and push it up inside any male cadaver's dick. He'd say, "Oh look, the corpse has got a boner." This guy was really weird. He looked like Larry of the Three Stooges. I think he had some necrophiliac tendencies. He'd get real upset if there weren't any female bodies to work on. He'd start pacing. I caught him one time in the prep room. He said he was just taking a pee in the hopper at the end of the table. He was just pulling up his pants when I walked in. I said, "I won't tell if you don't." You say you were once caught in the act of necrophilia once? Yeah, I had tried to kill myself and was living in a halfway house a couple of blocks up from this funeral home. I decided to go to the mausoleum and try and kill myself again. The mausoleum had a door connecting it to the mortuary. I was sitting in there, real depressed, when, just for the hell of it, I decided to try running my driver's license along the edge of the door, and click, the door popped open. I couldn't believe it. So I tried it again, and the door popped open again. I went into the prep room, and there happened to be a body in there. I had me some fun, did my thing, and forgot all about killing myself. I told the folks at the halfway house that I stayed the night with friends. I went in there several times. Sometimes there were absolutely no bodies, so I turned around and snuck back out. I usually went in the back door. About a week later, I snuck back into the funeral home. I was on the prep table, having a good old time, when all of a sudden I felt like there was somebody nearby. Next thing, I heard people walking down the hallway. I quietly jumped off the table and threw the sheet back over the body. My clothes were in quite a state of disarray, and I had blood on me and everything else. It had been an autopsy case. There was a casket with the lid open in the side casket room, so I ran and hid behind it. The casket was on a church truck, so they couldn't see me, but they could see my legs. It was a man and a woman. They were standing there saying, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" One of them said to the other, "You go get the gun and call the cops, and I'll stay down here." I knew I only had one chance then, so I busted out and ran. I knew the layout of the place, so I just ran down the hall and out of the place and out of the cemetery. At the time, I still had a friend who worked at the funeral home. He said, "Somebody broke into the funeral home. They know it was you." They put in an alarm after that. I think they called the police, but there were never any charges. I'm sure they didn't want the publicity. That was the last time I got very close, except for I've broken into a few tombs. Have you seen any changes in people's attitudes toward necrophilia? Yeah, when I came out here, I noticed it. It's almost a fad. They're not really necrophiles, but pseudo-necrophiles, like a death cult. But there are probably a lot of people who would do it if they had the opportunity. Perhaps there is this vast network of necrophiles who, for lack of a forum, will never know of each other's existence. Well, there's Leela, Wendell's group, American Association of Necrophilic Research and Enlightenment. They try and get some information out about it. It must be frustrating when people say, "We have to cure you," or "You've got to be more like us." It is. For a while, I found myself thinking, yeah, this isn't normal. Why can't I be like other people? Why doesn't the same pair of shoes fit me just right? I went through all that personal hell and finally accepted myself and realized that's just me. That's my nature, and I might as well enjoy it. I'm miserable when I try to be something I'm not. And two, a lot of these people who are putting me down have hang-ups worse than I have, or they do things that might be considered questionable by their peers. I had a gay friend who, when he found out I was a necrophile, said, You can go to hell for that. After 1979, when I was put on probation, part of the probation requirement was that I seek therapy. I had a really nice social worker. She was cool, very non-judgmental. The more I talked to these people, the more I realized necrophilia makes sense for me. The reason I was having a problem with it was because I couldn't accept myself. I was still trying to live my life by other people's standards. To accept it was peace. These people who are always trying to change me only helped me get myself more in touch with my feelings. I used to go from the therapist's office to the funeral home. It didn't work, folks. The Canadian independent film Kissed was loosely inspired by the life of Karen Greenlee. Its depiction of necrophilia is much more tasteful and refined than the reality of it. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.